Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Automation Hour. We are thrilled to have you all with us today. So we're going to get through kind of our housekeeping before we jump into today's content. All right. So first of all, we have all the lines muted. However, we absolutely love hearing from you. So we have both the question widget here in GoToWebinar as well as on the community that you can post the questions and we will answer those throughout the session. We are recording this and we'll post it to our YouTube channel after we conclude today. And of course, we invite you to connect with us wherever it makes the most sense for you, whether that's on the Trailblazer community, our website, Twitter, LinkedIn, or YouTube. All right, so we're going boot camp this year. We're almost halfway through the year, cannot even believe it. But we are going to be doing scheduled triggered flows today. We spent a lot of the beginning half of the year preparing you for how to get ready to build flows and doing your design. And so now we're actually into the building blocks part of it. And for the second half of the year, we are going to continue with some more of those sessions on how to build different flows. And then we're going to get into things that you need to keep in mind while you're building flows, like limits, error handling, and go into some additional automation options in Salesforce beyond just flow, because this is Automation Hour, not Flow Hour, right? So we hope you join us for as many or as few of those as you would like. So yes, we also want to make sure we say thank you to our sponsors. First up, Concrete.io. They've been with us since the beginning. Of course, our next sponsor, who joined us more recently, is Sumo Scheduler. So huge shout out to them for their support of our webinar. And of course, last but not least, we want to give a huge thank you out to ActiveCampaign for their contributions as well to helping us bring you this webinar every other week at no cost to you. All right, so your co-host, as always, we have me today, Michelle Hansen, as well as Rakesh Gupta. But we know you're not here to see us. We're here for the main event, and that is brought to us by Marshall King. So Marshall, I'm going to pass it on over to you.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, everybody, for being here today. Briefly, Marshall King. I'm a business enablement lead at Clearsulting, so I help run our Salesforce platform for the firm. In the community, I'm a co-leader of the Dallas Flow Wizards user group, along with Nana Gregg. We meet here in the Dallas area and have some really good discussions about flow and user experience. I've had the opportunity to present at Dreamforce and some of the Dreamin' events, and I have been on Automation Hour before, so I'm really happy to be with you today and would love for you to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm not a Twitter user or anything like that, but I do keep an eye on LinkedIn and would love to connect with you. And one of my favorite things to do is help people figure out flow challenges. So if you have one, feel free to reach out to me. So for today, we're going to talk about schedule triggered flow. I'm not going to read all this slide, but basically what we're going to do is we're going to go into an introduction of schedule triggered flow, talk about some of the features and capabilities, some of the interesting challenges they present and can solve, and then we're going to get hands-on with an actual flow. We'll take a look at how it works and we'll go in there and modify it a little bit. Along the way on each slide, I have screenshots of actual scheduled flows from our org. So I'll talk about each of those just to give you an idea of some of the use cases, some of the problems that a scheduled triggered flow can solve for you. Because I think that's one of the things that people struggle with sometimes with flow is like, it sounds really cool, but I'm not always sure when to use it or how it can work for me. So hopefully I can give you some ideas about how a scheduled triggered flow can work for you. So we'll dig right in. What is a scheduled triggered flow? As you probably can guess from the name, it is a flow that is designed to run on a schedule, daily or weekly. So it's not being triggered by any activity or event, not by the editing of a record or a platform. It is literally just scheduled to run in your org automatically. You can also create a schedule triggered flow and run it once, and I'll give you an example of that and why you might do that. It's really useful for maybe doing some data cleanup or data population that you need to have done. Most of the time, a schedule triggered flow is going to run on a set of records. So you'll pick an object, you'll pick entry criteria, which we will talk about today, and then you'll pick your schedule, and then it's just going to run on the records that meet that criteria. The most important thing that people need to learn about schedule triggered flows, and where I see people get the most confused, is that it's running on a set of records, but it's still running one record at a time. And I have another slide that will go into detail on how that works. But this is often where people get off track with a schedule triggered flow is thinking they have to treat it like it's processing thousands of records. It's processing one. So you keep that in your mind as you're architecting the flow. It's obviously not real time, it's scheduled, so it's good for things that don't have to be real time, things that you want to process nightly or weekly, things that maybe you're gathering data together. Our example today is creating a snapshot of data that we want to be able to store and report on. So it's great for that type of data management and data processing. And I like it a lot because it can process large volumes of data in a very efficient manner. So you can set your criteria to have a very broad scope of records, and then it'll run on all those records nightly or weekly or whatever the criteria is that we give it. Now, I used to tell people that schedule triggered flows were great for dealing with limits, volume limits in flows. Salesforce has been loosening those quite a bit, so that's not as big of a use case, but I still think it's a very efficient way to process data. You want to think about what should be happening in your org real time versus what could wait overnight, because every time you add things that are happening in real time when you're editing records or creating records, there's the potential for performance problems. And so even though maybe flows don't have the same limits they used to have, you still want to consider the performance of your org. So let me talk about this screenshot. Before I do, I'm going to advance to one slide. So we have a process at Clearsalting. We call it the weekly check-in. We use Financial Force, now called Certinia, for all of our professional services management, including time entry. And so we enter time cards weekly. And our CFO wanted to start capturing what we just call, like weekly engagement, a weekly check-in. How was your week? So you can see over here on the left, there's a little flow. This is a screen flow with some custom components where somebody can just very quickly with one click say, I had a great week, my week was so-so, or I didn't have a great week. And then we monitor that. We want to know, we want people at Clearsalting to be really, happy with their jobs and satisfied with what they're doing. We want them to have mostly good weeks. And so we take a look at that. The average metric is actually on our executive dashboard. So that was working great for us, but then we wanted to get a participation rate. And the challenge with this flow is it's not required. So if you choose not to participate, there's just no record of your participation that week. So it was hard to figure out how many people participated and how many people could have potentially participated. So what we did is we created a scheduled flow. It runs every Sunday after the week has ended. It runs on all of our active team members. So that's the record entry. It's a resource, and it's looking for people that are active, and it goes to see if they checked in. And if they did, you can see on the right branch, it just does nothing, it moves on. If they didn't, it creates a check-in with just a 0 score. So now we can very easily see how many people were eligible to check in, how many did, and so we can not only gauge the employee sentiment, but we can also gauge participation in the survey. So just one little simple, you can see it's a very simple flow, a couple of elements, but it works really well for us. Okay, so let's talk about scheduled flows versus scheduled paths. Some of you may have worked with scheduled paths before. A scheduled path is inside of a record triggered flow, and you can set that path to fire before or after some date field on the record. So maybe 10 days after something is created, you want to take an action, or maybe 5 days before the opportunity update or opportunity close date was updated, you want to do something. Those work really well, but those still require a record action to trigger. So the scheduled path won't run unless you've had an action on the record, an insert or an update that then triggers the flow, and then the scheduled path is out there waiting to do its thing at whatever particular date you specified. So that's great, but again, it has to be activated by an action on the record. A scheduled flow, it just runs. It runs on the schedule and it processes the data that you ask it to process. So it doesn't have to have a triggering event. You could have an opportunity that hasn't been updated in 10 years and a scheduled flow could still update it tonight. So that's really the difference between the two. And you have to think about, what is that triggering event, or do you even have a triggering event when deciding between a scheduled path versus a scheduled flow? So our next use case is actually still related to the check-in. So I mentioned we built this flow to do the 0 score check-ins to get the non-participants. Well, we did that flow about 6 months after the check-in started. And so now we have 6 months of data that doesn't have the 0 participation data. So what I did is I took that first flow, I did a save as, and I modified it to go backwards, looking at somebody's start date, and if they have an end date, looking at their end date, and then just looping through each week to see if they did a check-in, and if they didn't, it creates the record. So this is a one-time flow. It's not scheduled. It says weekly up there, but I ran it once and I deactivated it, and it just went backwards and it populated hundreds of records for me, so that now, going back to the very beginning of our check-in process, I have a participation rate for everybody in the firm since the beginning. So it's a good example. I could have probably done a couple of exports and done some VLOOKUPs and so on and so forth, but I found it a lot easier just to write this flow and get the flow to do all the work for me. We'll pause for just a second. Michelle, have there been any questions that I should address now?
So we have one question that's come in, but I think it's probably better to save that one for just a little bit.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so this is the most important slide in my opinion. This is about how you work with records. And I mentioned this at the beginning, and I want to really emphasize this right now. When you run a flow, a scheduled flow on an object with entry criteria, it's going to potentially process dozens or hundreds or thousands of records, okay? However, each flow interview is only one record. When you design a schedule triggered flow, you need to design it as if you're working with one single record. And in this flow, there is a $record variable. Just like in a record triggered flow, there's that $record, which is the record that triggered the flow. You have the exact same thing in a scheduled flow. So as an example, if you had a flow that was going to run on your opportunities and you thought it was going to process 1,000 opportunities, don't think of it as this flow fires tonight and it processes 1,000 records. Think of it as this flow fires tonight 1,000 times, and each time it fires, it runs one of those 1,000 records. So again, write the flow as if it's only processing one single opportunity. I've seen people where they just didn't understand that concept, which is fine. This is all new to us. But they had a schedule triggered flow that was going to process 1,000 records. They didn't quite understand that. So the first thing they did in their flow was they had a get, and they went out and got those records. That means you're going to process 1,000 records 1,000 times. So now you're updating like 1,000,000 records, which obviously is not necessary, inefficient, not the way you want to do it. So anytime that you've built a scheduled flow with an object, you're processing records one at a time, and that's how your flow should be designed. And that's why I say flows are efficient, because you don't have to put in all of this really complex getting and looping and assigning. You just process the record that is being passed into the flow each time. So if there are any questions about that, ask them. We can go back and reiterate that and reemphasize that. But this is probably the most important thing for understanding how you want to architect a scheduled flow.
So we do have a question about that. Heidi went, okay, so this is interesting. So which is more likely to hit apex limits? For example, if you were to do the processing of all 1,000 records in the flow versus what the scheduled flow does with processing one record per flow and running 1,000.
I honestly, I can't answer that question off the top of my head. There are some scheduled flow limits that I'll talk about later at the presentation. So there are considerations with scheduled flows. There's a certain number of interviews you can have per day. And so we'll take a look at that. But whether you want to do a scheduled flow that processes 1,000 or whether you want to do 1,000 scheduled triggered flows, I would honestly have to do a little research on that. But I've had personally better luck with a scheduled flow because it's inside of the flow itself, it's doing so little theoretically, right? And so you have all of these flow interviews you're allowed to have. I think it's 250,000, or there's a number times the number of users you have, which I do have in a later slide. So I personally find it a little easier to do it as a scheduled flow rather than like one big flow that processes everything. Back previously, you couldn't do a big flow that processes everything. It would fail every time. Now you have more options, but I still find it just easier to think about and architect a flow on one record at a time. That's a good question.
Gotcha. Yep. So Gustavo chimed in with, does this mean a get records element should not be used?
Well, it doesn't necessarily not get used, but you don't need to do it to get the records you're processing. Actually, let me give you an example. So let me talk about this next use case that I've got on the side here. I already mentioned that we use Certinia for our time entry, and time is due every week. And every Saturday night, we run a process runs to see who missed their time card. But we want to get as much time in the system as possible. So what we have every Friday at noon is a process that runs to see if the person has submitted a time card or not. So this flow here is set up on our resources. It's running one resource at a time for our active resources. And first thing it does, it makes sure they start, because sometimes we have resources that are starting in the future. If they've already started, it looks to see if they've submitted a time card by doing a get. So I am doing a get here, but I'm not doing a get on the resource. that individual resource, that individual team member is automatically being passed to the flow, and I'm just doing a get to see if they submitted a time card for the week. And if not, I send them an email saying, hey, don't forget, time cards are due this week. So a second way for them to be reminded of their time card. So it's not that you can't do a get. I just want to emphasize that you don't need to do any gets for the records that you're processing. Salesforce has already done that to you, and it's already passed a record into your flow. I hope that makes sense, but happy to answer more questions about that, because that's probably the most important concept about architecting these scheduled flows. Okay, I'm going to keep going, but definitely appreciate the questions. Was there another question, Michelle?
There's a couple, but let's wait a couple slides. I think you may start answering these questions, and then we can follow up if there's more outstanding.
All right, sounds perfect. Okay, so you can have a schedule triggered flow that actually doesn't have an object and it doesn't have entry criteria. So in that case, the flow just fires once because it's not firing on a set of records. It's just basically you're saying, I want you to go out every night or every week and I want you to do stuff. There's no $ record variable because it's not working off of records. It's just literally scheduled to do something. So you can almost think of it as an auto-launched flow, but you're scheduling it instead of calling it from some other type of flow. In this case, this is a good case going back to the last question. In this case, it doesn't do anything for you. You have to do it all. So you might do gets, you might do loops, you might do assignments, you might do all the normal things you would do in a flow, but the benefit is that it's scheduled to run every night. So this particular use case is pretty simple. We wanted to capture some information every week about the number of team members we had, how many internal versus external, how many by practice. We use that data for some of our reporting and trending. And so every week on the weekend, we fire a process. It's not built on an object. It goes out and gets all of our active team members, and then it goes through a series of filters and loops and assignments. And we have a couple of custom objects where we just update how many overall team members we have, and then how many team members we have by practice at the time. So pretty simple concept, but instead of me having to go figure out a way to schedule it, Salesforce provides that mechanism and it does it for us every week. Okay, so let's talk about the actual scheduling, and we're going to do this part live when we get hands-on with the flow. So by default, when you're scheduling your flow, you can run it once, you can run it daily, and you can run it weekly, which is great. You don't have monthly, you don't have semi-weekly or something like that, but you can do that with a decision. And like I said, we'll actually do this in a minute, but you'll see in this screenshot, this is a project snapshot flow. We wanted it to run on Wednesdays, and we wanted it to run on the first of the month. And so we've scheduled it for daily. And the first thing it does is looks at a formula, which I'll show you in a minute, and it says, is today Wednesday? If it's Wednesday, then we create our snapshot. If it's not Wednesday, it bypasses that process, and then it says, what day of the month is it? And if it's the first, it creates a snapshot, and if it's not, it skips it. So you can get pretty creative with decisions inside of the flow to get monthly, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, the 1st and the 15th, things like that. So we'll actually do the second two examples. We'll do Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and we'll do the 1st and the 15th of the month when we get hands-on in our flow. Okay, so let's keep going. So this is our use case. This is where we're going to get hands-on today. We're going to create opportunity snapshots. Some of you probably know that Salesforce has a report snapshot capability. It's pretty good. It's not great. It's really old. So it's not been updated to Lightning. It's barely been updated to Classic, but it has some limitations. And so we have a little bit more sophisticated use case around snapshots. So we use a scheduled flow. So before we actually get into the flow, let's just talk a little bit about requirements. We rely really heavily on opportunity products. That's how we align with our practice information and product information, and we get a lot of valuable metrics from products. So we can't just snapshot the opportunity. That would be completely inadequate for our needs. We need to snapshot the opportunity and the product. But obviously there's a relationship there. So when we build the opportunity snapshot, we've got to be able to build the products and link them to the opportunity snapshot. So that's what we're trying to accomplish in our scenario that we'll do here in our flow. Now, one way you could have potentially solved this would be to schedule the opportunity snapshot and then have the opportunity snapshot trigger a record. So it would be a record triggered flow to go get the products and do the product work. nothing wrong with that. That would have also worked. You have two flows you kind of have to maintain and work with. I don't know if you remember this scene. Hopefully we have some Office fans on here, but one of my favorite scenes is when Kevin decided to be super efficient with his language. Me think, why waste time, say lot word when few word do trick? And I feel that way about flows. Like, why create two flows or three flows or a bunch of flows if you could get it all done in one flow? So we're going to keep this mindset today of trying to keep it simple and keep it organized and keep it kind of concise. And then the last thing I want to show you are the formulas that we'll use. There are other formulas that could be beneficial, but when we create our decisions, these are the two formulas we'll use. So the day formula gives you the day of the month. So today is the 16th, so the day formula for today would return 16. And then the weekday gives you the day of the week. 1 is Sunday, 2 is Monday, etc. So today would be 6. So both of those formulas are already in the flow. I went ahead and added them to save us some time, and we'll use those to do our decision. So before we dig in, Michelle, any questions I should address before we go into the flow?
Yes, this is actually a great time for a couple of questions that have come in. So first, I think back a couple of pages for what we were talking about not needing to do a get. Or whatever. Jacques wanted to know if I have a formula field that gets all the records that I need to modify, doesn't Salesforce run it in a batch of 200 at a time?
I'm not sure I follow the formula field part. There are some batching mechanisms in Salesforce when you process volumes of data. So that is true. But I'm not sure 100% what you're trying to get at there. If you want to clarify kind of what you're thinking would be a different solution or better solution. And I want to say, right, that like this has worked for us, but Salesforce is super flexible, as we all know. It's why we like it. So there are probably definitely different ways to do what I'm going to show you today or what I've shown you above.
Absolutely. And yes, they do bulkify the flow run. So if it's set to run on one record at a time because of the way scheduled flows work, they do batch them on the back end for us at Salesforce, which I think is really cool.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's also good to know that happens too. So you're not totally worrying about those apex limits.
Yeah.
All right. So Ralph asked, apologies if this is answered or asked before, but are there any reporting or analytics features available to track the performance and effectiveness of schedule triggered flows?
That's a good question, Arulp, who I used to work with. So he's trying to send me hard questions just to be a mean guy. I actually don't know of anything like that. There could be somebody out there on the call, or Michelle, you may have encountered that. But no, I'm not aware of anything that gives you like actual performance metrics on the flow itself. There's certainly places you can check limits and how many limits you're using, or how many, how much of your limits you're using. But I'm not, are you aware of anything, Michelle?
I'm not. The only sort of reporting or analytics metrics I've seen around flows is on screen flows. I know there's a couple of reports that you can build on screen flows, but I have not found that there's anything for any other type of flow.
Okay, there you go, Arulp. There's your
Panda
answer.
sad face. Panda sad face. We should ask Salesforce for that. This is on the exchange later. So, all right. Juan asked a question, and I think this is a great place for it. So let's say I have an email scheduled to go out 45 days after an opportunity closes. But day 45 is a Saturday or a Sunday, and I only want the email to go out on a weekday. How can I get that email to go out on the following Monday? And
Well, that would probably I so you could potentially do that with a scheduled path, which we talked about earlier. You could handle it with a scheduled flow, and it actually might be better because the scheduled path is going to fire when it fires. You'll kind of see how you might do that when I get hands-on, but what you could potentially do is you'd need to keep track of, have you sent the email yet? So you'd probably need a checkbox on your opportunity that says, have I sent the email? And then you'd have your scheduled flow that looks to see if the opportunity is eligible for email, meaning if the 45 days have passed. And so if the 45 days have passed, then it would enter your flow. But the first thing you would do is a decision. What day is it? If it's Saturday or Sunday, then you don't do anything. And so I would write my flow criteria to say where the days passed is 45 or greater, and my checkbox hasn't been checked. So it's going to run on the 45th day. Oh, that's Saturday. It'll run on the 46th day. That's Sunday. It'll run on the 47th day. That's Monday. Send the email, check the box, and then that opportunity won't enter your flow anymore because you checked the box. So just off the top of my head, that's how I would solve that.
Yeah, and I think that's where there's a lot of debate around scheduled path versus scheduled flows. And so a lot of times that's kind of where I go is, as long as it's scheduled for always the scheduled path and there's no kind of wiggle room in there, that works great. As soon as you start introducing some of that, do this, except if it's this, don't do it, then all of a sudden it makes it going forward.
Yeah, exactly. Because that 45-day scheduled path is going to fire and then it's done. It's not going to go back and do it again. Whereas with the scheduled flow, using that clever entry criteria, you can get more sophisticated. Now, there actually is a
Absolutely.
challenge with using dates in entry criteria. I have a reference at the end of the slides on how you can overcome that challenge, which you would need for this particular scenario.
Absolutely. All right. So Greg chimed in with, here's an office quote from Marshall. I have a lot of questions. Number one, how dare you? Love, Greg.
Thank you
Guessing
for
you know Greg.
my former coworkers are joining to make sure this is as awkward and uncomfortable for me as possible, which is how it was working with them as well. So I think we're continuing the tradition. But no, I appreciate you guys showing up. It's very nice.
We fully support this behavior on office hours, so keep it coming, y'all. So, all right, Alan would like to know, is it true that the entry criteria cannot be dynamic? So you can't compare dates to today's dates?
That's correct. I have a link to an article about how to overcome that, and we can talk about it. My experience, the best way is to do some sort of a formula field. So in that example of the 45-day scenario that I mentioned, you could have a formula field that says, is today 45 days after the close date? And the minute you hit 45, the box is checked, and then it enters into your scheduled flow. So that is a known limitation. I think of all of even record triggered flows, I think have that same limitation around dates. So you have to get a little creative with that. Or another alternative, which is not as great on efficiency, is you could have every record enter the flow and then check the date in a decision, which does allow dynamic dates, but it's probably better to do it as some sort of a formula field or something like that. Good
Yeah,
questions.
that's definitely
Good
always been my
questions.
trick, is to build a formula field on the object that gets, basically it's a checkbox that gets checked once my criteria is when I need to deal with dynamic dates. Um, Safe Harbor, I did just have a conversation with the flow team about this, and it's something that they are looking at. And I know nothing more than that, and there are no dates or timelines to be discussed at all, but they are aware that this is a thing and it makes us all unhappy, so they're taking a look at it.
Awesome. It's good to know.
Absolutely. Heidi had actually chimed back in. Possibly we could deal with this whole don't send on the weekend thing by implementing business phase in the org. Um, that's an interesting theory I have absolutely not tried.
Yeah, same here. That would be new to me, but we'd love to hear somebody work it out and show us.
Yeah, I sent a future automation hour presentation. Hint, hint, Heidi.
Heidi, get on it.
All right, so let's see. More of your old coworkers, no question. Just wanted to say hi, Marshall from Heather Rosario, from an old colleague.
Hello. Thank you for coming.
All right, so Gustavo said, right now I'm struggling with a date field, but I need to set the criteria on when this date field equals back 3 months or back 12 months from the date of when the flow runs, which is daily. So in a decision element, I need to compare whether that field is 3 months or 12 months back of when the flow runs. So that's when I think you would be running this flow daily on all the records. And honestly, I don't like that idea anyway, now that I say that. I think this is where I would use a checkbox formula that basically says, is today's date today minus 3 months or today's date minus 12 months? And if yes, check the box. And if the box is checked, run the flow. And if it's not checked, don't run the flow on the record. What do you think, Marshall?
That's exactly what I would do for sure. Yep.
Awesome. So next question that came in from Kristen. Is there any way to find if a scheduled flow was successful other than having a report that checks for those updates? I know I can look at the scheduled jobs and setup to see that it triggered, but I want to see how many records it updated. And I haven't found a way other than a report based on the criteria in the scheduled flow.
Yeah, that's a great question. Off the top, I know you can look in flow interviews, but I don't think that'll give you a sense of the number of records. So what you could potentially do is make that another field that you update on the record. Maybe like the date that this flow updated the record. So again, it still would have to run a report, but you could, easily filter to that field rather than looking at the created date or the modified date or something like that.
Yeah. I can also tell
Well,
you,
actually,
Kristen, this is another thing that we talked to the flow team about and was like, this is obnoxious because I've run into a couple times where I know there are records that this should have triggered on that it did not trigger on, and I cannot tell you why.
yeah,
So
we're going to talk a little bit
fingers
about
crossed we don't.
yeah, debugging is a bit of a challenge. We'll talk about a couple of options here, but yeah, that's an interesting challenge.
All right, so Jean came back and said, should the formula field be used to avoid having a get in the flow as the entry criteria would be for the example record. So basically the formula field gets typed to true. Then in that case, Salesforce processes them one record per interview at a time versus sending a batch of 200 to the flow. So yeah, what they do is if you have any sort of entry criteria on your object, then it runs the flow as if it is one per interview, one record per interview. But then on the back end, they bulkify that one per flow interview into batches of 200 flow interviews to do all the processing and work. So in that case, you would still build it per Marshall's instructions as if you were only working at one record at a time. So, boy,
Awesome.
y'all are talkative today. I'm struggling to catch up with all the questions, but I think I may have gotten through them all. So
Well,
let's say that for now. I'll let you go ahead.
yeah, except for Greg, those were all great questions. So thank you guys for asking them. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the actual flow. I hope I haven't been logged out here. It looks like I'm good. So this is our sandbox, of course, and this is the actual flow. So we're just going to go through each element to talk about, to review what we've already talked about today. So here we have our start element, and we have the start date and the start time, and we have the frequency, once, daily, weekly. We've talked about this. One thing to be aware of, which is covered in this help bubble, is that this start time is based on your org's time zone. And I have to keep that in mind because our org is East Coast, but I'm Central. So if I don't schedule it in the future by an hour, it won't fire for me. The other thing is if you schedule a flow and you've got a start date and a start time in the past, it actually just doesn't do anything. So you want to make sure you have your date and time in the future. One thing I'll also mention, this took me a while to learn, which I'm kind of embarrassed, but sometimes we're going to talk about debugging one record at a time to see how it works, but sometimes you want to run the whole thing and see how it works. And I used to think, well, I'm going to have to pick the next 15-minute increment and then sit around and wait. But what I realized one day is actually you can type over this data. So if I wanted to run this in 2 minutes, I could just go in here and type 3:35 p.m. So it took me an embarrassingly long time to realize I could just type a number in there. Next, we have our object and our entry criteria. So again, this is optional. If you want to do something kind of unique and not specifically bound to data records, you can leave this part out. But in our scenario, this is an opportunity snapshot. So our goal, which I didn't really mention, but our goal is to see our sales pipeline and how it's growing or changing over time. We want to be able to monitor that weekly, and we want to be able to monitor it monthly. So we're capturing, we're firing off of our opportunity records. And we either want the opportunity records that are still open, so is closed is false, opportunities we haven't won or lost yet, or if we've won it, we want to just capture it one final time, capturing its final disposition after winning. So since this runs weekly, I just basically say if it's open, or if it was closed in the last 7 days. And so here's a good example where you can't use a dynamic date. So this is a formula, how many days since it closed, and then we just compare it to the number 7. So I know that I won't miss anything because I'll get everything closed in the last week, and we run weekly. So I had actually forgotten about this, but this is a great example of how we dealt with a date limitation on the entry criteria. So again, this could be 1,000 opportunities, could be 2,000 opportunities, it could be 10, but it's going to process all those opportunities one at a time. So we've had a lot of questions about gets. So I do have a get in here because we want to get our opportunity products. That's one of our key requirements, is not just the opportunity, but the opportunity products. So this is a standard get, but we're getting the products where the opportunity ID of those products equals the record. So again, one record, one opportunity. Give me the products for one opportunity. And I want to store all the records and store all the fields. Very standard stuff here. And so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create the snapshot, because we need to have that snapshot ID to attach to the product snapshot records. So this is a very simple create. We're just specifying all the fields. So you can see these are the fields in my snapshot object over here on the left. These are all the fields from the record, the one record that is being processed in this flow. You'll see there's a field called snapshot date, which is capturing the current date. So we're not using the created date in our reporting. We're using this snapshot date to determine when this snapshot got created. Because remember, this is weekly. So the same opportunity could show up week after week after week. I need to be able to tell when this snapshot occurred so I can do the trending and the analysis that we want. So bunch of fields here. Again, pretty standard. We're going to loop through the products now, because now we have an opportunity snapshot ID. So we want to loop through all those products, and we're going to assign them to a record variable. This is all totally normal flow stuff that this boot camp that the automation hour team has put together is, should have prepared you for all of this. There's one little thing in here that's new to me. Maybe other people have known it, but it's a little tiny simplification. So you can see here, the very first thing we do is we have a variable for our single product, and we assign it the opportunity snapshot ID. So this is that create that we did early on above. And then after that, it's again just mapping the loop data into the variable. So again, just a bunch of fields. We have, again, the snapshot date on the product records, so on and so forth. So what I recently discovered, and it's a very tiny little thing, but I like to do it because I feel like it keeps things a little cleaner, is that you can do all of your assignments to your record variable, and then in the same assignment, you can assign that record variable to your collection. Used to be I would do all the assignments to the record variable in one assignment, and then I would have a second assignment that would add it to the collection. That's perfectly fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I just kind of like having one assignment that does all of the work for me. So as long as you put this at the end, you're going to capture all the data above in that collection. So we repeat that loop for every product. We keep adding it to our collection. And then the last thing we do is we create all of those snapshots in one create. So we're doing multiple, and we're using our collection of products to create all the data. I know this has been reiterated in other sessions, but you don't want to do creates inside of your loop or updates. You want to be as efficient as possible with these processes. Even if you aren't worried about limits, it's just more efficient for the system. There's better performance, things like that. So you gather it all together in that collection, and then you do one big create at the end. So I want to take this and get fancy with the schedule. But before I do, I want to see if there are any questions about the demo that I just went through, or the example I went through, to see if there's anything people want to ask about.
We do have a couple. So David said at least you were honest enough to admit that you didn't know that you could actually type over that. Kristen agreed and said, seriously, that was an epiphany when I figured out that was a typable field. I'm like, you mean I don't? Okay, I'm doing this for 1 minute in the future. Let's go.
Exactly.
So, Pavel would like to know, what does VFP in your API name stand for?
So most of the people that have been harassing me on this call are from VFP Consulting. And I used to work at VFP Consulting with these wonderful people. And we at VFP, we implemented this solution for ClearSalting. So I worked at VFP, and I was part of the team that implemented, and then I left and went to ClearSalting. So, best practice, we try to put a prefix in front of the field names to help track the things that we've done. So a lot of the app partners like Financial Force and others, they will do the same thing. They put an abbreviation in front of all their objects and API names and fields and so on and so forth to help track what they've done. So good question.
Perfect. Okay, so Juan had chimed back in and asked, is there any way to reschedule a scheduled event to run on a weekday if the action you want to happen, like send an email, falls on a weekend?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what we covered earlier, where you could have a decision. We're actually going to add a couple of decisions here in a minute, where you could have a decision that says, is it the weekend? Okay, then skip it. But you need to be able, the one thing I want to reiterate is if you're going to do that, you need to be able to keep track of when you actually did send the email. Otherwise, it's just, every Monday through Friday, it'll send your email. So you need to basically say, don't send on Saturday, come back the next day. Don't send on Sunday, come back the next day, send it on Monday, and then check a box, fill in a field, whatever you want to do that says, okay, I've sent that email. I don't need to send it again.
Yeah, I think the
We're gonna
question is,
we're gonna
can we
do that
do
here in
this?
just a minute.
Yeah, I think the question is, can we reschedule a scheduled path instead of using a scheduled flow? I'm not sure I know of any way to do that on a scheduled.
Yeah, I've never seen that ability. I think, like I said earlier, the scheduled path, in my understanding, it runs once based on all the criteria you provided, and then it's finished running.
I have a possible idea, but I think it's a terrible one, so I'm not going to actually air it publicly on a recorded broadcast so nobody can come back to me and be like, Michelle, that was super stupid. But one, unfortunately, I think our answer is we don't know a way to reschedule a scheduled path if there's some sort of strict criteria that you don't want it to fire right back,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
But I will say, if you're doing, like, if this is the same 45-day example, you could easily handle that with a schedule triggered flow. It doesn't have to be a scheduled path. It would just be a flow, again, a flow combined with a formula field that says, has it been 45 days? If it has, then enter the flow and do the thing, check the weekday, all of those types of things. Any other questions?
Awesome. Nope, I think we got them all answered.
Okay, cool. So let's make this a little more sophisticated with our schedule. So what we're going to do is we're going to start out right here at the top, and we're going to add a decision. And we're going to basically say, is it Monday, Wednesday, or Friday? All right. And I've already added a formula. I meant to open that up first. I'll come back and open it up in a second. But you can see here, I've got two formulas, day of month, day of week. So I'm going to say day of week equals Sunday is 1, so Monday is 2. So I'm going to say day of week is 2. Day of week is 4. And day of week is 6. And then I'm going to change it over here to or. So if the day of the week is Monday, Wednesday, or Friday, go down this branch. Otherwise, I like to specify the default branch just so we all know what we're doing here. And remember to enter your descriptions, which show up on the canvas. So that's best practice as well, but we're going to skip that for now. Okay, so now we have this path, which we want to go down and do all of our snapshot work. So we're going to take this path right now and we're going to end it. And we'll come back and change that later. So and also we would change this to daily. So we'll do that. Oops, right here. Okay, so if I were to activate this now, it's going to run every night, and it's going to run daily, and it will go through here. And if it's Monday, Wednesday, Friday, it's going to go down this path and create my snapshots. And if it's not, it's just going to exit. Okay, so we could be done there, but we also want to capture monthly snapshots. We want to capture them on the 1st and the 15th. So what I'm going to do is, after that initial pass, I'm going to add another decision, because remember, it could be Monday and the 1st. So we need to capture 2 snapshots on that particular day. So now we're going to add another decision, and we're going to say 1st or 15th. And then we'll say the same thing here, yes, 1st or 15th. And we're going to use that other formula for the day of the month, equals 1, day of month equals 15, and pay attention to your naming conventions. It makes it really easy to find things. So think about that when you're building out your flows. And again, we're going to change this to or, if it's the 1st or the 15th. And then over here, we're going to say, no, not 1st or 15th. Okay, so that's great, but that's way down here. And the stuff I need to do is way up there. So we're going to connect this branch up to the beginning of the flow that gets the opportunity products. and then this one would exit. So now we have a situation where it could go, oh, actually, one more thing we need to do. Sorry, we need to connect this, because if it's not Monday, Wednesday, Friday, it could still be the 1st or the 15th. So this needs to connect down to that same decision. It's going to shift around and look cool. There we go. So now it's going to fire every day. If it's Monday, Wednesday, Friday, it will go down this path. If it's not, it will go down this path. Then it will come down here and say, okay, cool, I've done one snapshot, maybe. Is it the 1st or the 15th? If it is, I'm going to go down this path, which will take me right back up here and do a second snapshot for the 1st or the 15th. Otherwise, it'll just exit. So you can get really crazy. Like we could have done this in 2 flows, right? We could have had a weekly flow and a monthly flow, but again, why do more flow when few flow work? So whatever that was. So we want to keep it pretty simple. Now there's one thing I would add to this flow. It could potentially fire twice on the same day, and you want to be able to separate what's a weekly and what's a monthly. Otherwise, you've got 2 records. How do you report on them? That sort of thing. So what we typically do is we create a field on that snapshot that is the snapshot type or the time period or some pick list type field. So what I'm going to do very quickly is an assignment. And I'm going to say assign weekly snapshot type. And I already created a variable earlier, snapshot type right here, and it's going to equal opportunity weekly. And then to be lazy, I'm just going to copy it, and then we'll do it right here. And we'll clean it up so it's not ugly. And we'll change the name to monthly snapshot type. And then down here, we'll change this to monthly. And then we'll add this to our create. So when we create our opportunity snapshot, we'll add that field. Snapshot type equals var snapshot type. So now you can very easily run a trend report on your weekly snapshots, a trend report on your monthly snapshots, have a lot of really nice clean data in one pretty simple flow.
Awesome. So we had one other question come in.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
So could this be 2 or more scheduled flows that call the same subflow each? So Pavel said he just got the idea that that might be another option for doing this. And I think that's really interesting and goes into a debate we had earlier in the year about flow architecture. Do we do, you know, what flows rule the whole project or one flow for each thing you want? And I think now that introduces that same kind of design complexity into scheduled flows where I had never thought to put before. So it's well, just stirring it up.
Yeah, you could totally do a snapshot. I mean, a subflow. I thought about that when preparing this demo. You could basically have a decision and then your subflow under each decision, or you could have 2 flows that then call the subflow. Totally great, you know, alternate solution to this challenge for sure. I love subflows because, yeah, you build it all in one place. If you need to make any changes, you make it in one place, and then you just call it from various places as needed.
100%. We have a session on that coming up here fairly soon.
Perfect.
So, all right, I think that's all the questions for now.
Okay, good. I've got a few minutes left. So let's talk about debugging. So debugging is a real pain with scheduled flows. There's the debug button. You can click it. I haven't saved, so it's giving me this error. Here's the problem with debug. You don't know what record it's going to pick. It's going to pick something that meets the criteria, but you could have 1,000 records that meet the criteria. It's going to pick one of them. That's a real hassle to see if it worked correctly, especially if you're updating that record. You got to go find that record. It's just really unfortunate. So what I typically do, somebody may have a better solution, but what I typically do is while I'm testing, I just go in there and hard code an ID into the entry criteria. So we could literally just say ID, the opportunity ID equals, and I don't have one saved, but you know, put in your criteria here, and then you could just say or 4. and now it's going to run on this opportunity only. And you can see the debug path, you can follow it, you can go look at the results, and you can get a sense of if it's working correctly or not. If you want to run it on all of your records, you just need to schedule it and activate it and let it fire. At least that's been my experience, and that's where editing this date and time. So if I wanted to do this today for everybody, which I'm not going to do, I would come in here, I would schedule it at 3:50, let's say 3:52 p.m., and then I would leave it at daily. And again, you have to activate it, so I would save it, activate it, and then wait the minute or two for it to run and then go check the results. That's how I typically do the testing and the debugging of these flows, but definitely would love feedback from anybody else that's done something different.
And I think this is actually a really good call out because Heidi just went, so wait, scheduled flows don't actually allow you to pick the debug record you test with because, other flows do.
You are correct. Yeah, it would be great if we could. But no, you can see here the debug screen has just these two options, no other options. But, we can get around it. Not the best experience, but it's, it's possible.
And I think for sure that's where the conversation with the team comes in. Maybe finding a way to make sure that it verifies if it runs over all the records that you expect it to with a scheduled flow. Like if I know I have 1,000 accounts where my checkbox is checked, but I can figure out that I only somehow had like 900 records update. What happened to those other 100? I don't think we have any good way to debug or troubleshoot that.
Yeah, that's a good challenge and frustrating. And I would say I'm not always great about this, but when you first put a scheduled flow into production or sandbox, that you really monitor it carefully in the beginning to make sure it's actually doing everything you think it should and it's not missing something. So, I would, if it were me, I would like have a report that has the same criteria as the entry criteria, and I'd be comparing my report to whatever results I expected to see, and just, doing some cross-checking to make sure that it seems to be processing everything correctly.
Absolutely. I think that's terrible. It's an option for personally. So,
yeah.
All right. So Mary would like to know, what does debug pause element mean?
You can put pauses in. Yeah, you can put pauses in your flows. I haven't myself actually done pauses, to be quite honest, so maybe somebody on the call. The only time I've done a pause is I think that a pause allows you to separate, this is a whole other topic, but if you've ever dealt with an issue where you're trying to update setup information like user information, and you want to update non-setup information like just opportunities or regular data, Salesforce won't let you do that in the same transaction. And a pause will close one transaction and start another one, so you can separate those two data manipulation. You'll see what are called DML errors for data manipulation language, or I think that's what DML stands for. So that's the only time I've ever used a pause. I'm sure there are some really good use cases for them. I think actually Greg, who's on the call, he's used some pauses. Sometimes in a flow, you might create parents and children, and you need the parent to be there first, and it may need to get updated by something before the children get created. And if it happens all at once, then those parent updates don't happen. So you might do your parent record, have a pause, could be just a minute or two, and then do your children to make sure that the parent has had a chance to go through all of the automations, triggers, flows, workflows before the children get created. I think that's a common use case for a pause that I've seen. So anyway, you can again, I haven't done this part, so somebody else may have, but I guess you can actually pause, because when you do a pause, it's a time period, so you can actually pause, or you can skip the pause. That's how I understand that checkbox to be used. So if your pause is 10 days, you probably don't want to pause for 10 days and see how your flow works.
Right, absolutely. So I think a good call out with this is that pauses are not available in every type of flow that's out there. I'm not actually sure they're available in scheduled flow. I wonder if that's a holdover from a different debug screen, because Pavel had basically written in, and okay, Greg says they are available in there, and Pavel and I both are apparently behind the ball, because I don't think either one of us realized that was available in scheduled flows, and now I have a whole new thing to play with. Thank you, Chris, for reminding me my voice.
Yeah,
Oh,
it does show up here. Yeah,
nice.
you cut out just a little bit, Michelle. Is there another question?
It does. Yes. So, Gustavo would like to know, why do you use end? So in the list of elements that you can add to the canvas, end was an option.
Well, you just might want to stop. Let's take this example right here. Um, if let's say I wasn't doing the monthly snapshot, just the weekly snapshot, then if it's Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I want to go do something. But if it's not, I just want to stop. My flow is done. That was in a couple of the screenshots. If I flip back over, go up a couple. So here's a good example where we're trying to see if the user has already submitted their time card. If they have, then there's nothing for the flow to do, so the flow just needs to exit. Or actually, that's down here. The flow needs to exit. So yeah, end is an option when you're dealing with decisions, even loops, and you want to exit what you're doing and just stop processing for whatever reason.
Yeah, I think it's generally Salesforce puts it in places that it makes sense automatically, but there are places that you could build your flow out a certain way that make it better for you to add that in.
Yeah. I know we're almost out of time. I just have like a couple more things. Let me just go through them quickly and then we can see if there are other questions. This is an example of the result. So we did a snapshot flow. We're looking at a weekly snapshot. We can see our opportunity pipeline growing and shrinking over time. The bars represent our practices. So this is the type of reporting analytics and metrics that we need to understand how our sales are doing and how our sales progress and what are our typical patterns and things like that. So this is one of the many results you could get out of that reporting. You could do it by person, you could do it by region, just various ways you could look at your sales information. Here's a link to some Salesforce help with some flow consideration. I didn't list all of them, but I listed the ones that I thought were most relevant. So obviously you can only trigger a flow with a schedule. You can't treat it like a subflow and call it. It has to be scheduled and run that way. I mentioned this, the start time is based on your org's default time zone. Here's the limits conversation that we had earlier. So per 24 hours, you get 250,000 scheduled flow interviews or the number of your users times 200, whichever is greater. And that's one thing to think about. I've shown you how you could do a flow with a decision. Even if it goes to the decision and it exit and it doesn't do anything, that is a flow interview. So you do want to think about that as you're designing. If you're worried about those limits, that might not be the best solution for you to design your flow, because it's going to fire for a bunch of records and actually not do any work. So it's just something to think about. I don't know how many people get close to those limits, but it's a possibility. Once you've scheduled a flow, if you go to the scheduled jobs and setup, you'll actually see it sitting there waiting to fire. And if you delete that, it's not just deleting the next schedule, it's deleting all of them. So if you do go into setup and delete that scheduled job, you have to go back to your flow, change the date and time, and then reactivate it in order to get that schedule set up again. And I mentioned if you have it scheduled in the past that it won't run. And also there's just an automated process user. That's the user that runs scheduled triggered flows. So it's not any individual user in the system. It's the automated process user. And then lastly, I wasn't actually able to find a ton of resources about flow, about scheduled triggered flows. There is a trailhead trail that you can follow. I have not done this, but you can schedule a flow hourly with Apex. So if somebody has a need for a frequency more than daily, proceed at your own risk. But I found this and thought it might be useful for some people. The next link is a useful guide to understanding which flow type you might use. So we've had a lot of questions today about should it be triggered, should it be a pass, should it be this? That guide can kind of help you understand the capabilities of the different flow types and help you make a decision on the best flow type for your needs. And then we've talked about this a bunch of times, the ability to filter on date values and how people handle that, which generally is a formula field or a decision in the flow. But this article here goes through those different options. And this will get posted out to the community, and that way you'll have access to those links. So that is it. My clock just hit 3 o'clock. So I'm available for any questions if there are any. I appreciate everybody attending today and asking really great questions. I really appreciate the level of engagement.
Absolutely. So we don't have the PowerPoint link in here on just yet, but we'll post it to the Trailblazer community, and it'll also be a link in the comments on the YouTube video when we post it. So Heidi had asked that question. So YouTube is always where you can go for. Yes, Marshall, thank you so much for presenting today. This was a fantastic session. Former coworkers, good job on the heckling and the fun questions. The rest of you, thank you for the excellent questions. Nana had also suggested that possibly some error handling might be able to stamp the record with details about why it didn't get processed. And I absolutely think that's a great idea, because it would help us figure out whether or not it even entered the process, like if the flow fired on it at all or not. So for sure. Love this.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Marshall, for everything. And we will see you all in a couple weeks for the next episode of Automation Hour. Have a
Awesome.
great
Thanks,
rest of your day.
Michelle. Bye, everybody.